And then narrowing that body awareness down just to the breath. Knowing whether you're on an in-breath or an out-breath. Knowing if the breath is relaxed and easeful, or if it's tight and constricted. Not changing the breath, just letting it be exactly like it is, but knowing what's true. Being careful not to confuse thinking about the breath with experiencing the breath. What we're after is the felt sense of the breath, not a thought about the breath. And when the mind wanders, when you notice that the mind has wandered, you don't have to tell a story about it. You don't have to beat yourself up for being a bad meditator. All you need to do is drop whatever mental activity is underway and return to the breath. Welcome to the Insight Meditation Community of Charlotte. This is the moment when, if we were together in person, we would ask you to turn to someone and introduce yourself. If you're not familiar with Zoom, it's possible to toggle back and forth between speaker view, where you only see the person speaking, and gallery view, where you see everyone. So this might be a good moment to just move to gallery view and see who's with us tonight, if you'd like to do that. It's not the same as being together in person, but it sure is nice to see all of y'all electronically. You may be aware that there's a chat function in Zoom, and so I'm going to give a Dharma talk now, and if you have questions that you want to chat in across the bottom, well, on a laptop, on a desktop, there's a chat link, and you just chat your question in. On iPads and iPhones, it's a little different, but the function is there too. So you may be aware that tonight is the third night of our 5-week Sutta Summer series. And so each evening, the Dharma leader explores a sutta that she or he finds meaningful. And as you may know, a sutta, that's the Pali word, the Sanskrit word is sutra, and it's a discourse or a teaching that comes from the Pali Canon, which is the primary record of the Buddha's teachings that's used in this tradition, the insight meditation tradition. So tonight, the sutta that I want us to look at is, the name of it is the Dvida Vataka Sutta. And really that translates into two kinds of thought. For those of you who follow such things, this is Majjhima Nikaya 19. So 20 minutes, which is what we try to keep our Dharma talks to, is not enough to do justice to most suttas, and this one is somewhat lengthy. So the part of the sutta that I want to talk about is where the Buddha discussed the two types of thoughts that might arise. The rest of it is interesting, but there's a kind of a clean break between the part I'm going to talk about and the rest of it. So I want to give you, what I would like to do is read the sutta, but I'm not going to do that because I think it would take some time to do, and I'm going to go through the most salient lines kind of as I explore it with you. But what I do want to do is give you my version of the cliff notes to the sutta. And so this is an oversimplified summary that I hope will be helpful. Okay, can people see that on the screen? Okay, thank you. So there are three main points I want us to cover. The first thing the Buddha said was, he said, I'm going to divide my thoughts into two kinds, unwholesome, and then the three specific harmfulness. So that's one kind. And the second is wholesome thoughts, renunciation, non-ill will, that is loving kindness, and non-cruelty, that is compassion. So the first piece is divide my thoughts into two kinds. The second is, he said, when I did so, here's what I noticed. Unwholesome thoughts lead to harm for myself and others, and they obstruct clarity and insight. And wholesome thoughts do not lead to harm for myself and others, and they facilitate clarity and insight. That sounds promising. And then the last observation he has is, when I saw this, the unwholesome thoughts subsided. And when they did arise, I abandoned or removed them. And then on the wholesome side, he said, and this is a little bit of a strange statement to me, but it's not untrue. He said, even when they're wholesome thoughts, if I'm doing too much thinking, that can strain and disturb the mind. And when this happened, I just moved to concentration practice. So that's the quick and dirty. And one of the things that I really like, that's the quick and dirty. You know, it's not possible to do it justice in a short summary. So it's much richer and it's much more nuanced than that. But I think that captures the spirit of it. So one of the things I really appreciate about this sutta, one of the reasons I chose this one as one of my favorites is, I'm going to read you just the first sentence. Before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose I divide my thoughts into two classes. So this is before the Buddha became enlightened. And so I like that. I like hearing something from him before his awakening. Not much of what we see in the Pali Canon is from before his awakening. So he left home and he lived as a wandering ascetic for 6 years before he finally reached awakening. And suttas are notorious for being hard to place in time. The chronology is very challenging, but this is one of the ones where we can tell that it was in that 6-year period. So sometimes the wisdom of the Dharma can be a little bit intimidating. I don't know about you, but I think it can be. And when we hear some profound insight of the Buddha, we might think to ourselves, well, yeah, you know, if I was fully awakened, I could have figured that out. But this is not about an insight realized by a fully awakened person. It's an insight realized by an unawakened person, a seeker just like you and me. And so that, I think that's encouraging. That gives me hope and inspiration as to what we can do. So another thing that I appreciate about this sutta is that it has such simplicity in the method that he's describing. You know, a lot of times with the difficulties we encounter in life, we get all caught up in emotional turmoil and drama, and these things can seem unimaginably complex. And the more we try to resolve them, the more complex sometimes they seem to become. The Buddha often used the analogy of a tangle that is in need of untangling. And when we're enmeshed in the tangle, it's easy to overlook the simple things. So the simple thing is divide your thoughts into two categories, wholesome and unwholesome. You know, there were a lot of millennia where humans, if they wanted something heavy moved, they had to drag it around, and if it was too heavy, they couldn't do it. It had to stay where it was. And then one day somebody discovered that you could put a wheel on an axle and you could move all kinds of stuff around. A very simple solution, but very useful. And once it was discovered, people could take advantage of it. So classifying our thoughts as either wholesome or unwholesome is simple, but immensely useful. So I do want to go through a few of the lines in the sutta here. Now, to use the technique that he's recommending, it requires that we apply an activity that we often speak of in the context of insight meditation, and that is mindfulness. So in order to classify thoughts, we have to be mindful, number one, that there is a thought arising, and number two, what that thought is. So the Buddha said, I understood thus, this thought of ill will has arisen in me. And he said, the counterpoint, I understood thus, this thought of loving kindness has arisen in me. So, you know, it's a little unusual to hear somebody in our day-to-day lives state that they're aware that a thought has arisen. That's an unusual thing. And when we first hear it in the sutta, it sounds a little redundant, but it's not redundant. It's rare because mindfulness of arising thoughts is rare. And the Buddha was making a point. He said it for a reason, that mindfulness of our thoughts is a prerequisite for classifying them as wholesome or unwholesome. If we're not aware of them, we can't go to the next step of classifying. So once he was aware of arising thoughts, then he began the process of dividing them into wholesome and unwholesome. So here, another activity from insight meditation is called for, and that is investigation. So again, this is from the sutta. This thought of ill will leads to my own affliction, to others' affliction, and to the affliction of both. It obstructs wisdom, it causes difficulties, and it leads away from nibbana, or awakening. And the counterpart, this thought of loving kindness does not lead to my affliction, or to others' affliction, or to the affliction of both. It aids wisdom, it does not cause difficulties, and it leads to nibbana. So having moved from mindfulness to investigation, then he was evaluating the impact of his thoughts on himself, on the world around him, and on his spiritual progress. And finally, he used what he observed to bring about progress on the path. So he mentioned three possible responses that he had to the outcome of his investigation. And the first one is when he noticed these unwholesome thoughts and they subsided naturally. So again, this is from the sutta. When I considered this leads to my own affliction, it subsided in me, the thought subsided. When I considered this leads to others' affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to the affliction of both, it subsided in me. When I considered this obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from nibbana, it subsided in me. So this kind of insight is sometimes referred to as the self-liberating nature of the Dhamma. Seeing for the 1,001st time that my ill will towards somebody else only creates suffering for myself, sometimes when I see it, I will finally get disgusted with it. And I will say, you know, I'm not doing this dance again. This is not doing me any good. And there's a natural releasing of that behavior because we see it's not effective. But it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes we can't rely on this natural self-liberation. And so he continued, whenever a thought of ill will arose in me, I abandoned it. Now, abandonment is a little more active than the thought simply subsiding on its own. It does require some action to abandon the thought, but it doesn't require a real high degree of effort. But unfortunately, abandonment doesn't always do the trick either. So the Buddha continued, whenever a thought of ill will arose in me, I abandoned it, removed it, did away with it. Now, in the phrase removed it and did away with it, what I hear is an even more active effort to eliminate the unwholesome thought. And for me, the takeaway from this description is, in some cases, seeing the unwholesome thought is enough and it causes them to subside. In other cases, we have to take more active effort to eliminate unwholesome thoughts. Now, there's one more thing that I like about this sutta. There are many things. There's one more thing I want to comment on. And I appreciate that he pointed out that these wholesome and unwholesome thoughts are creating habits for us. So here are his words again. Here are the words he spoke. Whatever one frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of the mind. Whatever one frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of the mind. Now, most of us know that this statement has a lot of truth in it, and we know it with respect to our actions. We think about the diseases that are rampant in the United States, and they aren't so prevalent because we don't have facts. We don't know what causes them. We know what causes them. They're prevalent because we find it's difficult to change our habits. Diet and exercise are great remedies for a lot of these conditions, but it's hard to change habits. Here, what the Buddha was saying was, it's not just our actions where these habits come into play, but it's also our thoughts. So he went on to say, if she frequently thinks and ponders on thoughts of ill will, she has abandoned the thought of loving kindness to cultivate the thought of ill will, and her mind inclines to thoughts of ill will. So he's giving us another pointer here. Contradictory thoughts cannot be held in the mind simultaneously. If we're holding an unwholesome thought, then it is inevitable we cannot accommodate a wholesome thought. And the more mind moments we hold unwholesome thoughts, the less space there is for the wholesome. And of course, it works the other way. The more mind moments we can make sure are occupied by wholesome thoughts, the less room there is for the unwholesome. And so what we're doing when we cultivate the wholesome is we're creating the habit of mind so that those wholesome thoughts support us. Now, there's one more point that I want to make about this sutta, and it's the relationship to the Noble Eightfold Path. So remember, this is before the Buddha's awakening, but interestingly, it turns out that this is precisely the second path factor. So even though he saw this before his awakening, it was exactly what would come to be the second factor on the Eightfold Path. And that is right intention. So I'm going to put another diagram on the screen, if I'm lucky. Let's see. Okay, so this is the second column over from the left is headed up path factor, and these are the 8 factors on the Noble Eightfold Path. And to the left of them, you can see they're grouped into 3 categories: the wisdom factors of right view and intention, ethical behavior factors of right speech, action, and livelihood, and the mind training or meditation factors of effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Because this sutta is about one of the 2 wisdom factors, right intention, we'll leave behind the ethical behavior and the mind training groups down at the bottom and just focus on right intention. So the third column describes what is dispelled by cultivating this path factor. And what you'll see there, the 3 things that are dispelled are ignorance, desire, and aversion. Often those are referred to as greed, hatred, and delusion, the 3 unwholesome roots. They're different in nature. Ignorance is more of a cognitive unwholesome root, and desire and aversion are more emotive, more emotion-based. If you move to the right, one more column, you'll see that aversion can be either within the self or toward others. And then the final column on the right shows the antidote. And what you see is the antidote for desire is renunciation. The antidote for aversion toward the self is loving kindness, and the antidote toward aversion toward others is compassion. Now, there are different words used in the sutta here and there. Getting the terminology to align perfectly can be a challenge. But this is kind of the big overview here. All right, I'm going to take that down now. And the sutta, just to restate it, talks about renunciation, loving kindness, and compassion as the 3 remedies that's being offered. I'm going to make one last point, and that is sometimes we hear this Eightfold Path referred to as the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. And let me say that I'm guilty of using that terminology myself, but that's not accurate. The Buddha taught that he identified this path. Now, this is an important distinction, I think. He taught he identified the path, but he did not claim authorship. He did not say, this is my path. His understanding was the path is more like a collection of natural laws. So while Isaac Newton named and investigated the force that we refer to as gravity, he didn't create it. He wasn't the author of the law of gravity. So I'm going to close with a quote from another sutta. This is the Nagara Sutta. And here the Buddha is describing his own awakening. And he uses the analogy of someone who is uncovering an overgrown path from long ago. And he says, it is just as if a man traveling along a wilderness track were to see an ancient path, an ancient road traveled by people of former times. In the same way, I saw an ancient path, an ancient road traveled by rightly self-awakened ones of former times. And what is that ancient path, that road traveled by the rightly self-awakened ones of former times? Just this noble eightfold path. I followed that path. So he's saying that he has uncovered again a long established path. So I hope this has been interesting. I hope this tells you a little bit about the sutta. I hope it connects the sutta to the path. And we do have a little time for questions or comments, and I will wait and see if any show up. And if not, we are meditators and we know how to sit quietly. So one question is, you describe some ethical behavior. Can you give some examples? So the three categories in the path are right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Speech is pretty clear. Livelihood is pretty clear, and action kind of comprises everything else. That's a rough way to say it, but the ethical behavior is the foundation of the meditation practice. It's really a talk. It's a talk in and of itself. So I guess the suggestion I would have would be to do a little reading about the second group, the ethical behavior group of right speech, action, and livelihood, and maybe we'll have another talk on that soon. Let's see. I have a question about not being able to replace, excuse me. Question for you about one thought not being able to replace the other, but what about when they swap very quickly? So what I'm hearing there is, yes, okay, I've got a wholesome thought in this moment, but then in the next moment, guess what? Not so much. And they do, the mind moments go so fast. And that's one of the benefits of meditation is we slow down somewhat and we can begin to see our mind moments a little more carefully. On a long residential retreat, when we get them back someday, you can, it is that much more accessible to you. But what do we do when they swap very quickly? The only thing when I first started practice, I thought, if I do this right, I'll see every mind moment. And that's not realistic. The mind, I don't know, people say 50, 100 mind moments per second. I don't know what the right answer is, but it's a lot. And I don't think the key is seeing every mind moment. I think the key is whichever mind moments are available to us out of that many, many mind moments, whichever ones are available, knowing them and working with them. And so the only thing I can say is as these mind moments swap out, knowing, classifying them as wholesome or unwholesome, and when they're unwholesome, working with them to move toward more wholesome. And the suggestion here, one of the suggestions is just seeing them and seeing whether or not they lead to happiness or unhappiness. I don't think that completely answers the question, but anyway, I hope that helps. Would you please spell the name of this sutta? Sure, I can cheat for that. Dvida Vataka. So Vataka is a Pali word that means applied thought. So we're talking about two kinds of thought, and Vataka has a very specific meaning in the jhana practice. The answer to the question is D-V-E-D-H-A, D-V-E-D-H-A, and then Vataka, V-I-T-A-K-K-A. So the Dvida Vataka Sutta. And here's a question: why focus on duality when seeking unity? So I will understand that question to be that when we divide our thoughts into wholesome and unwholesome, that is creating duality, or I don't know if it's creating duality, it's using a categorization system of duality. Why do that when we're seeking unity? So in my experience, there is so much of the Dharma where we are asked to hold things that are seemingly contradictory. We're asked to hold them side by side, and maybe we can't resolve the apparent contradiction at this moment. Sometimes we just have to put things aside. The whole distinction between duality and unity, I think for me, that is seeing things from different perspectives. I can see something, see duality, find it to be useful and apply it so that I can move ahead in a more skillful way. I can also look at it from the point of view of unity, and that can be useful. And I think it's a mistake to try to say one has to be true and one has to be false. I think what's more useful is to, if there's an apparent conflict, hold it as an open question and see if time and practice and study sheds new light on it. So, okay. Thank you for your questions. Let's see if I can find our announcements here. So our Sutta Summer Series continues for 2 more weeks. That'll be through the end of June. If you have not seen this, we have resumed the instruction period that goes from 7 to 7:25. It's a separate Zoom link. The email you get every week should have both a link to the instruction period and a link to the main meeting that we have. And if you're relatively new and you would like to participate in the instruction period, please do. We have a Dharma leader who has set aside their time from 7 to 7:25 every week to lead that. If you're not relatively new, but you think it might be helpful to hear the instructions again, please join us. It's not restricted to people who are brand new. And if you know of anybody that might be interested, you can share the link and invite them to join. Many of you know that on July 15th, we will have a guest leader, quite a distinguished guest leader. It'll be a Zoom session. A Theravadan monk by the name of Bhikkhu Bodhi. And so that is not to be missed. And I don't know what to say about him except that I just want to encourage you. I think you will not be disappointed. It'll start at 7 o'clock. Instead of having the instruction period that night, we will start at 7 so that we can have more time to hear from Bhikkhu Bodhi. And that is on the website. And you can check the website for other upcoming events and changes to events. The website is imccharlotte.org. If we were together in person, I would say there's a dana box in the back of the room. Dana is the practice of generosity, the Pali word for generosity. If you would like to support this community financially, since there is no dana box in the back of the room, you can go online to the website, and there are opportunities there to support the community financially. Okay, so we will close with our metta or loving kindness practice. So finding a comfortable posture. Before we begin, let's just take a moment to bring to mind a being or beings that we want to hold in loving kindness tonight, something that feels particularly in need of loving kindness, feels to us particularly in need of loving kindness. And I'll just name the demonstrations that have been going on in the last week or so, and the incidents of excessive use of force, and in particular, racially motivated excessive use of force. So I'll offer phrases that you can repeat silently to yourself. May I be safe from inner and outer harm. May I be happy and content. May I be healthy in body and mind. And may I live a life of well-being, free from suffering. Then moving to that individual or individuals that you identified earlier, and we'll hold all of those beings in loving kindness as we practice here. May you be safe from inner and outer harm. May you be happy and content. May you be healthy in body and mind. And may you live a life of well-being, free from suffering. And finally, broadening our metta or our loving kindness practice out to all beings everywhere. May all beings be safe from inner and outer harm. May all beings be happy and content. May all beings be healthy in body and mind. And may all beings, without exception, live lives of well-being free from suffering. So it's a pleasure being with you. Have a lovely evening.